Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you for joining our April program. Hi, I'm Elizabeth Rodriguez. I'm the programs chair for the Champaign County Audubon Society. And tonight we're going to have two speakers. They're going to be our Kinney Grant recipients from 2023. And if you don't know what our Kinney Grant program is, pretty much every year the Champaign County Audubon Society offers grants to fund ornithology research in Illinois. And our 2023 awardees are Laura Leichner, a Master of Science student at Illinois State University, and Cullen McKenzie, a doctoral student at Southern Illinois University. And so these two will be presenting their research that was funded by the Kinney Grant tonight. And I guess we can start with Laura. So whenever you are ready, you can share your screen. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Sure, I'll do the can you see my screen or can you not? I'll share it now. Okay. Alrighty, so my name is Lauren Leichner. I'm a master's student at Illinois State University in the lab of Dr. Pierman Nietlischbach. And today I'd like to share with you some of my thesis research that was supported by you guys at Champaign County Audubon Society. So my research is looking at breeding attempts in the house wren bird. So we're going to be looking at double brooding, as it's called, and how individual quality can affect this trait. So first I'll talk a little bit of some background information, and then I'll talk about what we're seeing in the long-term data set. And then lastly, we'll go over a cross-fostering experiment that we did. And all of this work was done in collaboration with Drs. Scott Sakaluk, Charles Thompson, and Pierman Nietlischbach. So the central question of my research has to do with life history theory. And the central idea of life history theory is that there are trade-offs between different things that an individual needs to do. So an individual has a limited amount of energy that they can allocate toward each of these categories. So we have a limited amount of energy to put toward maintenance, growth, reproduction, or defense. And so if, for example, we get an infection and we need to ramp up our immune system to fight off this infection, if we put in more energy to our defense, that leaves us with less energy to put toward reproduction or growth. So we're limited in our energy to put toward these different categories. And we have different trade-offs within each of these categories as well. So more specifically, what we'll be looking at is a trade-off within reproduction between the quantity of offspring and the quality of offspring. So as we see here, if we look at A on this figure, if we have a very high number of offspring, each of those offspring are going to be relatively low quality because we don't have the resources to put into all of those offspring. However, if we have a relatively lower quantity of offspring on that B spot, then the quality of that offspring is going to be relatively greater. So an individual wants to maximize their fitness and reduce their costs in their reproductive attempt. And the data you're seeing here is from our population of house wrens, but this is kind of a general trend. And the graph is a histogram of the relative frequency of clutch size, the number of eggs in the nest. So we can see that we have a lot of individuals producing a clutch size of 7 and relatively fewer of our other clutch sizes. And this black line that you're seeing is the relative fitness. So we can see if we produce a clutch size that is fairly small, we're missing out on some fitness opportunities that more offspring would grant us. So if we have 7 eggs, we'll have more offspring. Those offspring will go on to reproduce themselves and raise our fitness. However, if we lay too many eggs, then we won't have enough resources to put toward each offspring. So if we lay too many eggs, we give less effort to each offspring. They're of lower quality. This reduces our fitness. So we have this kind of average clutch size that we want to lay in order to maximize our fitness. So we're kind of constrained in each breeding attempt to a clutch size, in this case, of about 7. However, one way to get around this limitation is to produce multiple clutches of eggs in a season. And this is called producing a second brood, or double brooding. And the definition of a double brood is that after an individual lays their nest of eggs, they feed the young leave the nest. If that individual attempts a second nest, whether that is a success or failure, then that is their second brood. So it's after a first successful nest. The figure you're seeing here comes from data from the black-throated blue warbler, and we're seeing the number of offspring fledged over the day in the season, the first lay date. Our open squares are our individuals who have produced a second brood, and our filled squares are our individuals who only produced one brood, our single brooders. So we can see that kind of regardless of the time, our double brooders are able to fledge more offspring in a season. This is going to increase their annual fecundity and be beneficial for them. But even though we can see that producing a second brood is going to increase the number of offspring that you have, we still have this section early where even though these individuals have enough time to produce a second brood, they don't. So if producing a second brood is going to give them this benefit of more offspring fledged, and they have enough time to produce a second brood, why are these early individuals not going on to produce a second brood? So this is the main question of my research, and there are 2 main hypotheses to explain what might be going on here when we're looking at what affects the production of a second brood. So first, individuals are limited within the breeding season, and specifically migratory individuals have to travel to the breeding site, they have to raise their young, they need time to molt, and then they have to get back to their wintering grounds. And the conditions within the breeding season also often decline over time. So we see that the probability of producing a second brood declines over time, in part due to a reduction of food sources later in the season and that need to start molting and get back to your wintering grounds. However, like we just saw, we have those early individuals who don't go on to produce a second brood, even though they have enough time. So one hypothesis to explain this is the individual quality hypothesis, where several traits of an individual are coming together to form their quality, and that is positively associated with their fitness. And these traits that we'll talk more about later, but these traits can include things like age, perhaps they have a higher capacity to utilize resources, or perhaps they're in higher body condition, and that gives them the ability to produce a second brood. So looking at some of the other literature to give you an idea of what others have found about these 2 hypotheses, if we look at the hooded warbler, this study found that as time went on, the probability of producing a second brood declined over the breeding season. But when they looked at the condition of the individual, the clutch size, and the age, these other factors that could be associated with quality did not affect the production of a second brood. In the black-throated blue warbler, we saw that as clutch size increased, the probability to produce a second brood declined. And also, individuals in higher quality territory had a higher probability to produce a second brood, but the other 3 factors had little effect. And lastly, in our western bluebird, we saw some evidence for both of these hypotheses where the probability to produce a second brood declined over time. And also those individuals who are of higher body condition and older age also were more likely to produce a second brood. So we've got some varying evidence for both of these hypotheses in the literature. My study site is at Parkland's Merwin Nature Preserve that you can see here a little bit northeast of Bloomington Normal. And what you're seeing here is the number of individuals over time, so the date of their first successful nest. So we can see that the yellow is indicative of individuals who are single brooded. They didn't go on to produce a second brood. And now I'm going to overlay our histogram of double brooders. So we can see that in the early half of the season, about half of our individuals are going on to produce a second brood, but we still have quite a lot of individuals who are not going on to produce a second brood, even though they have enough time. So why is this? Our study species is the house wren, where we have a bunch of nest boxes at Merwin Nature Preserve, and they're an ideal species to study this question about double brooding in because they are migratory, they're constrained by time. Like we just saw, they produce 2 broods and there is variation in the production of a second brood. They also readily accept nest boxes and are tolerant of disturbance around the nest box, making them ideal for experimental studies. This population has also been studied for 44 years, so we've got a lot of records of reproduction that we can use to answer these questions. This is not such an easy question to answer, however, because a lot of these early birds also have higher quality characteristics. So in our study population, older individuals tended to also lay their first clutch of eggs early. So these early individuals who are also typically older, are they producing a second brood because they're early, or are they producing a second brood in part because they're older and of higher quality? So we're going to look at the long-term data sets. We're going to do a cross-fostering experiment to try and disentangle the effect of time and quality. And we're also going to calculate the repeatability of double brooding last. So in our long-term data set, we used data from 1997 to 2023. We were a little bit limited here in the span of time because one of our factors that we included in body condition was first measured in 1997, but we had records from 4,752 females. And the traits that we're going to look at that could be associated with quality are age, body condition, and territory quality. And in this analysis, we're also looking at the effect of time or when they first laid their first clutch of eggs. So I'll talk a little bit about each of these factors. So as we see on the right here, our black bars are individuals that are older, they're greater than 1 year old, and our open bars are our younger individuals, are 1 year old individuals. And on average, our older individuals are able to fledge a greater number of offspring. And this could be because high quality individuals are more likely to survive longer. So it may be that only high quality individuals get old, or our older individuals may have more experience, which allows them to produce more young and gives them a higher quality. So we're predicting that older individuals will be more likely to produce a second brood. We're also predicting that higher body condition will increase the likelihood of producing a second brood. This could be because with higher body condition, you may have a higher capability to lay more eggs, or you may be able to more effectively provision a second clutch of eggs. And this body condition can be affected by the environment, but there may also be an individual component to body condition. We see from a different population of house wrens that females in higher body condition tended to also have nestlings in higher body condition, So we've included condition as a component of quality here. So we're interested in which individuals have a higher mass because they are of higher quality. But our problem is that mass can be affected by a large number of characteristics other than the female itself. So we had to use a mixed model to estimate the female contribution to mass. So mass can be affected by the individual. It can also be affected by tarsus length, which is part of the leg of the bird. And this is because longer tarsus length is indicative of larger body size. And if you've got a larger body, you're typically heavier as well, just as a result of your body size. Hour of capture also affects mass because as we catch individuals over the course of the morning, their mass is going to increase over the course of the morning. Mass also changes over the nesting period. So as a female incubates her eggs, the young will hatch, and then she will start to provision those young. Over the course of that incubation and feeding the young, the female's mass is going to decline. And then we can also have effects between years where maybe one year there was abundant food and everyone was a higher mass, or vice versa. So we have these 4 other factors that affect mass outside of a female's quality. So we used a mixed model, we used statistics to account for these other factors and extract the female's contribution to mass or her body condition. This is called the best linear unbiased predictor, or BLUPS. So we use these BLUPS in order to estimate body condition, but you can think of this as what's the female contribution to her mass. Our third quality characteristic is territory quality. So high quality territory may have reduced predation risk. It may also have abundant food, which can reduce the cost of foraging. So we would predict that if the territory quality is higher, the female would be more likely to produce a second brood. And we have evidence from a variety of species. This is from the black kite, but we see this in other species. But we see that as estimations of territory quality increase, we typically see more fledglings produced on that territory. So because of this, the way we estimated territory quality is we looked at the number of fledglings that was produced in a nest box in the prior 6 years. So how many young were produced in this box in the prior 6 years? If more young were produced, that would be a higher quality territory, or our estimation of higher quality territory. And then lastly, like we talked about, we expect that only early nesting individuals are going to have enough time to produce a second brood. So we predict that as date increases or as time goes on, the likelihood of producing a second brood will decrease. And the date we use for this is the date the first egg was laid of a female's first clutch. So contrary to our expectations, we did not find any effect of age on the likelihood of producing a second brood. We also didn't see an effect of body condition on the likelihood of producing a second brood. And then opposite to what we predicted, we found that as territory quality increased, the likelihood of producing a second brood declined. And lastly, as we predicted with time, as time went on, as date increased, the likelihood of producing a second brood declined. So our model indicated that females in poor quality territory and those nesting earlier were more likely to produce a second brood. Now, what we're seeing with quality or with territory, it seems unlikely that it is the true effect that if we have lower food abundance and reduced predation risk, that we would see a decreased likelihood of producing a second brood. We may be capturing something else here with our estimation of territory quality, but this is one thing that requires more study in the future to see what's really going on here. So we're still seeing those individuals who are producing a first clutch early and then not going on to produce a second brood. So we're still left with this question of why this might be. So on the figure to the left here, we have this trend where as time goes on, females are less likely to produce a second brood. So if quality affects the production of a second brood, and if high quality individuals tend to nest earlier, what we can do is do an experiment where we delay those early nesting individuals in time. So if we look at our early nesting individual on the white dot, if we delay her in time, and if quality affects the production of a second brood, we would expect that early delayed individual to have a higher likelihood of producing a second brood, even though she was delayed in time. So I'll talk about this cross-fostering experiment next, and I'll walk you through how we were going to do this. So we have individuals that are breeding throughout time. So we're going to make pairs of nests where we have an early female who's nesting early, and then we have a later female who has laid her first clutch about 7 days later. So what we can do is we can swap the entire nest of eggs in between this pair of nests during incubation. And this leads our early female to be delayed in time. So her young are going to hatch later than she expected, and our later individual will be advanced in time. And then we'll also have unmanipulated individuals throughout time that will be able to compare what is the normal likelihood of producing a second brood at a certain time. So I'll walk you through this prediction figure. On the right-hand side here, we have the probability of producing a second brood on the y-axis. So 1 would be highly likely to produce a second brood. And then on our x-axis, we have time or the date the first egg was laid. So our black line is indicating our control. So this is the natural probability of producing a second brood at a given time. So if we have an individual laying her first clutch at about 140, looks like that she would be 0.35% likely to produce a second brood, or 35%. So we have our early individual. We're assuming that she is of higher quality. If she is of higher quality and we've delayed her in time, we would predict that she would be more likely to produce a second brood. So you can see the blue line is the delayed individual. We would expect her to be more likely to produce a second brood compared to the control because of her high quality characteristics. We can say the same thing about our later female. We would assume she would be of lower quality. So if she's advanced in time, we would predict that she would be less likely to produce a second brood. And to give you an example of the time that we're comparing, if we look at that early female on the top left, we're going to compare the date the first egg was laid at that later time. So at that orange circle is the time that we're going to compare. Is she more likely to produce a second brood when we compare her to an individual who has naturally laid a brood around the time of that orange circle? So this is our results figure. We've added something on here. Our dots are indicating one individual's first clutch. So our black dots are our control, the blue is the delayed, and our orange are our advanced. And what we found is that our delayed individuals did not differ from the control in their likelihood to produce a second brood, but opposite to what we had predicted, our advanced individuals were more likely to produce a second brood. So when we analyzed these results, we included time in the model. So it's not simply that our advanced group had more time to produce a second brood, because this was accounted for in the model. So this result also was a little surprising and will require some further studies to understand this result more. So we're still left kind of wondering here, what's going on? Do we really have some difference in quality between our individuals here? So we can turn back to our long-term data set, and we're going to calculate the repeatability of producing a second brood. So we're able to use a larger portion of the data set here. We use years from 1987 to 2023. And we had to use individuals present in greater than 1 year because we're calculating repeatability across years. And if we get a significant repeatability, that would indicate that individuals who produce second broods in 1 year typically produce a second brood in a second year as well. So significant repeatability would indicate that individuals typically produce a second brood, or they typically produce a single brood across years. So if quality influences the production of a second brood, we would expect to see significant repeatability here. And that's what we found. So this is indicating to us that something about the individual is influencing the production of a second brood. So it seems to not simply be time that's influencing the production of a second brood, but something about the individual as well. And when you include time in this model as well, the repeatability value increases. So it's not only, I guess, as I just mentioned, it's not only time, but traits of the individual that are influencing the production of a second brood. So to summarize what we just talked about here, we saw that individuals who lay early and those in poor quality territory were more likely to produce a second brood. Our individuals delayed in time, who we predicted to be of higher quality, did not differ from the control. However, what we saw is that the production of a second brood is repeatable. Individuals typically double brood, or they typically single brood. So this gives us some evidence for the quality hypothesis, but the traits that make up an individual's quality may be different from what we tested in our model. So what does this mean? As the climate is changing and we're seeing different environments here, some areas are experiencing an extension of the breeding season. So in some areas where individuals are either able to arrive early, or perhaps they depart from the breeding ground later, or both. In cases where that breeding season is extended, individuals have more time. If quality or something about the individual is influencing the production of a second brood, if that breeding season is extended, we may not see such an increase in the number of individuals who produce a second brood if it's not only due to time. So individuals may not, in this population, may not be able to exploit an extension of the breeding season if the climate changes in that way. So if it's due to some traits, characteristics of the individual, this may require genetic change over time rather than an ability to just adapt to a longer breeding season that they have more time. And this is important for the population because, as we talked about, producing two broods increases the number of offspring that an individual can produce in a season. And it's also important for population dynamics and sustaining a large population. And based on this research here, we also need to do more research from here to identify which of these traits are responsible for the production of a second brood. But we have some evidence for the quality hypothesis here. So thank you so much for your time today. I'd also like to thank my committee members and the members of Wren Crew and the Mouse Lab members. Thank you so much to Champaign County Audubon Society for their support on this research, as well as ISU and Phi Sigma Honor Society, and lastly, Parklands Foundation for land access. So thank you again for your time.
Okay, thank you so much. That was really interesting. And Colin, whenever you are ready to present, you can go ahead.
All right. Can everyone see this okay? Thumbs up. Awesome. Fantastic. Well, thank you everybody for coming to the talk. My name is Colin McKenzie, and I'm going to be talking about my chapter 4 of my PhD dissertation, which is investigation of prescribed burn management on grassland snakes and bird nesting success in Southern Illinois' tall grass prairies. My advisor is Dr. Michael Eicholtz, and I just wanted to give a big thank you for Champaign County Audubon Society for awarding this research with the Kendall Grant. So real quick, just briefly, who am I? So I grew up in Seattle. I always had an interest in biology, and I ended up going to Western Washington University to get a biology degree for ecology, where I studied physiology of spotted shrimp. Then I later did some lizard research looking at population dynamics in Southeast Oregon and looking at potential climate impacts on ant diversity. I then, after my time at Western, I ended up doing an internship in Paraguay where I looked at microplastics and toads, geckos, and other lizards. And then also looking at their diets and looking at how urbanization might impact these species. Then I went to Antioch University, New England to get my master's of science. And this is where I studied the endangered or threatened Blanding's turtle and looking at how road effect zones and kind of trails are impacting their potential populations and their movements. Afterwards, I studied horseshoe crabs in Massachusetts, looking at restoration ecology for them and seeing how maybe their salt, like a freshwater ecosystem turning into a salt estuary, and seeing how horseshoe crabs are managed in that area. And now I am in Southern Illinois University looking at snakes, prescribed burn management, and that impact it might have on snake distributions and their community. And when you see all these, you think, okay, these are a lot of different taxa, a lot of different species, but one major component that they have, which was a huge interest in my field of ecology, is disturbance ecology. And so as people, when we think of disturbance, we're going to quickly think of all the negatives that this can associate with humans. We might be thinking of huge, severe windstorms, hurricanes, tornadoes, something that can, completely destroy homes. We might be thinking of clear cutting, so disturbance on the landscape where we cut a whole bunch of trees down, change the structure of the ecosystem, and maybe affect the ecology there. We could be thinking about viruses or pathogens like COVID-19. We could be thinking of the disturbance that that has on people. We could also be thinking of urbanization and how this has a huge disturbance on the animals associated with it. There's also a field of evolution there. And one thing that we could think about is all these disturbances look like they would most likely be negative for a lot of animal species. But we also need to know that there's a necessity of disturbance. And this is especially true in primary ecosystems, like we'll be focused today on grasslands, because these are early successional ecosystems and they rely on a disturbance to occur so that they can be facilitated later. So for grasslands specifically, we're going to be talking about fire-dependent vegetation and how they need fire to be the disturbance to go across the landscape and maybe take out competitors. And this can actually, for certain species, facilitate germination and seeds of grasses or forbs. And the community structure that this builds can also be associated with microbial and animal communities as well. However, with humans, we have also suppressed fire as a disturbance, specifically in the Midwest. And so this can have dire consequences to these type of ecosystems, the vegetation present, and the animals as well. So why do we really care just based on the suppression? Well, in Illinois, less than 1% of Illinois' historic tallgrass prairie is remaining today. And a lot of the remaining prairie is actually super fragmented. It's really isolated. It's small, and it's having if there's less fire suppression, then there could be a lot of hardwood vegetation that can outcompete these grasses in this vegetation. So it's really important to try to maintain these ecosystems and hope to restore the habitat from agricultural that destroyed a lot of the habitat. And then we would hope that by restoring this type of habitat and maintaining, we could sustain obligate or facultative species. So for instance, certain birds that are really specialized in grassland habitats, and as well as just help the whole community relationships to preserve these ecosystems. So one really major way of doing that is through prescribed burns, a management action that is going to be talked through throughout this study. And Native Americans pioneered this management action hundreds of years ago. By burning the grassland environment, they were able to facilitate a difference in the type of vegetation that occurred. This would be, for instance, based on what we're interested in, a decrease in less favorable plants. So plants that might be big canopy cover plants or certain invasive species that might be taking over and outcompeting a lot of the native grasses that have evolved with prescribed burns. And then we'd hope to facilitate the native forbs, the cool warm season grass, Indian rice grass, big blue stem, etc., that can come up out of the fire, and they can do really well based after this disturbance. And by facilitating these native forbs, then we could potentially benefit grassland birds and mammals. There's been a lot of studies looking at grassland birds having a positive impact after a burn a couple years later, having higher nesting success, as well as mammals. So I just wanted to give a before and what a prescribed burn kind of looks like. So the first picture you see here is a recently ag site that was converted, was just left alone, unattended. So there's no seeding, there's no burning. So it really is filled up with Johnson grass currently, which is an invasive species in Illinois. And then right after a prescribed burn, it kind of looks like a bare space. But then hopefully we facilitate and help that there's these native forbs and grasses that makes this really interesting heterogeneous landscape across the site that this was burned at, and hopefully facilitating higher nesting success and a whole bunch of different community assemblages. So why do we care about grassland birds? Well, their conservation, they're rapidly declining. They're one of the most declining bird guilds in the world. And some of these species rely so much on tall grass prairies that they really need the nesting success to be there. And they're also really important ecologically. So we know that they're a predator across a lot of insectivores, seeds, vegetation, certain amphibians even. And they can also be a major prey source. So their eggs can be depredated by snakes, raccoons, a whole bunch of different predators that would love to eat their eggs. They also can facilitate a nutrient cycling through feces and seed dispersal by eating the seeds and then dispersing them across the landscape. And they're also ecosystem engineers by making their nest. They create a different kind of landscape across grasslands. So these three species I put emphasis on because these are three of the most common species that I'll be talking about at the site: the field sparrow, dick thistle, and indigo bunting, which are commonly found in South Illinois. So why snakes? So they also provide ecosystem-related functions. They also are a predator and prey. They can get depredated by mammals or certain large avian raptor birds. They are also can depredate bird eggs, small mammals, amphibians, other snakes. They also facilitate in secondary seed dispersal. So by depredating rodents, then they are also facilitating in the seeds after eating the rodent. And they can also help prevent zoonotic diseases. So by eating certain rodents and certain ag sites, it's actually beneficial to humans. Um, and then they're also a really research deficient taxonomic group. So this is because of their elusive behavior. They're really difficult to find. They're hard to see. So there's a lot less research done on them. And they're also really hard to track. They don't have any morphological characteristics of having the limbs or legs. We actually have to do a lot of times internal implementation on telemetry for them. So they can be really hard to do and research. And also the conservation implication that we talked about with grassland birds. You know, they're one of the main predators of grassland birds, so it'd be really interesting to be looking at snakes as well. So these are three of the snakes I wanted to put emphasis on: the eastern racer, prairie king snake, and black rat snake. These are all three species at the site that I'm working at that do often depredate grassland bird eggs. And yeah. Think it's frozen. Here we go. So this is a big concern because here's a field sparrow nest and here's an eastern racer depredating the nest. If we're interested in conserving these species and looking at, we want to just not just look at how prescribed burns impact them, but also how prescribed burns might impact this predation event. So, which relates to this part of my chapter, my dissertation. What's the impact prescribed burns have related to snake predation on grassland bird nests in southern Illinois? So here's my study site, Burning Star State Management Area in Elkville, Illinois. As you can see, just down southern Illinois. This is a site that has a whole bunch, is a reclaimed coal mine from 1994. We have 18 tallgrass prairie patches that we have conducted research on that are present here. But there's various management strategies. So this study has been going on for the past 6 years, 5 years before me with Dr. Glass and Dr. Eichholz from 2018 to 2022. And then I took this project over in 2023 to 2000 and continuing it until I finish. And so there's various management strategies here. Some of the sites were forest sites at first, so they were left undisturbed after they were a coal mine site. And then when we started doing research on them, they were an intermix of grassland to forest kind of habitat. Some sites were burned pretty yearly or burned, one after like 1 year and then burned just right after the next year. Some sites were ag fields, so they were converted into an ag field after they were coal mine. And then from the ag field, they were then either left unattained or they were left seeded or they were left burned. So there's a ton of different management strategies across all of these sites. As you can see here on the image to the right, some of the sites, we have a couple of the sites that were never burned, some of the sites that were burned recently in 2023, and a whole bunch of sites that were just burned in 2024. And then only a few of these were seeded. So my main predictor is time since last burn. However, because there's a lot of predictor variables, we're also going to be accounting for those as well for each site. So when I take this question, what's the impact prescribed burns have related to snake predation on grassland birds in southern Illinois? I can break it up into three separate questions. Is there a change in nesting abundance or diversity at recently burned sites? Is there a change in snakes, the predators, relative abundance at recently burned sites? Is there a relationship between eastern racers? So this is the most common predator of the grassland birds that we have seen through nesting videos. Movement in relation to active nests on burn sites. And will there be a change in predation pressure or nest success? So we're going to go into each one of these questions and break it down through the predictions and methodology. I think there we go. So objective 1, is there a change in nesting abundance or diversity at recently burned sites? To the right of me, here's a Bell's Vireo. This was when we always talk about grassland birds, we always think about the grassland birds that just nest inside the grasses about a foot up or around there. But there are grassland birds that we would associate, or birds we'd associate with grasslands that also nest inside the wooded area. So this objective is really just looking at nest abundance and diversity based on recently burned sites. I think it keeps freezing. All right. So the objective predictions. So when we have a prescribed burn, my first prediction is fires will remove woody vegetation and increase native forbs and grasses. Then I also think that this increase in native forbs and grasses will facilitate higher increase of bird nest abundance and diversity. However, I do think that there is a time lag to this, around 3 years. So as this 3-year mark comes and hits, so 3 growing seasons after the prescribed burn, that we're going to get an increase in woody vegetation and a decrease in the native forbs and grasses, maybe based on invasive species. And then this would actually facilitate a slow declining decrease in grassland bird nest abundance and diversity. So how are we going to be doing this? We're going to be doing this through nest searching. So the methodology will be using vegetation surveys. We'll be using a drone to look over the vegetation on a landscape scale, and then look at if it's hardwood or vegetation, what type of vegetation, grasses or forbs. Then we're also going to be doing surveys within the field. So we've been doing this since 2018, but we're going to be continuing it for every site that's active. So this is where we take out long meter transects and look at the composition with quadrats and robopoles, looking at the height of each site. And then we'll be doing nest searching. So nest searching is going to be used with rope dragging, where we attach ropes between each other. And then we have people in the back that will scout for flushing females or males coming out of the nest. And when we find a nest, then we will decide if we're going to put a camera near it, and they will be monitored over time. But for the objective one, the main focus is if there's a nest present and what species that nest is from. Then based on that then we will base that off on statistical multiple regression testing in R between and within sites, and use a PCA analysis, principal components analysis, to take account of those compounding variables, like what the site's management history is. So I want to get into objective 2. Is there a change in the snake predator's relative abundance at recently burned sites? Here pictured is a black king snake, also found to depredate grassland bird nest. However, it's much rarer than the other 3 species I showed previously. So my predictions are, I believe recently burned sites will initially decrease snake predator abundance. So I think that this is going to cause a decrease. The snakes are going to be leaving the grassland sites right after fire. However, I think generalist species will resurface after just a little bit of time. And these kind of snakes are going to be the eastern racer snakes, or the rat snakes that can come back into the grasslands because they're more of a habitat generalist. And I believe woody vegetation and increased litter depth will promote snake abundances. So this is really to help thermoregulate, give them some compositional or cover when they need to, as they don't want to be exposed as much out into the open without canopy coverage. So how am I going to be doing this? Well, the past couple years, we've been doing cover boards to look at occupancy. We've been putting out 25 plywood and 5 rubber cover boards at every site. And then these are checked 12 times, roughly once a week, from the months of May through August. So when we capture a snake, we will identify it, scale clip it to make sure that we know what species it is, or to make sure we know which individual it is. And then check those every 12 times. We will also be using drift fence arrays. So as pictured in B, this will be large silt fencing in a T shape. That's 4 to 5 of the sites. Each site will have each drift fence will have about 8 traps that will be dug into alongside, as pictured in B. And each of these traps will be baited with mouse bedding to help encourage snakes to come into the trap sites. And we will be doing statistical testing in R and multiple regression, as well as PCA to take care of some of these covariates, and repeated measures mixed models test for this. So let's see if the video is open. So my objective 3 is there a relationship between eastern racer, Colbert constrictor movement in relation to active nest at burn sites? So this is the main, as you're seeing here, this is the main predator that we've seen at Burning Star for grassland bird nest, chasing off a female dickcissel off her nest. So objective 3 predictions. I believe sea constrictor at burn sites will have increased long distance movements and a larger home range and sizes. So I think that prescribed burns will scare off the sea constrictor, eastern racer. And I think that because now it might not be in the most favorable habitat for sea constrictor, that they're actually going to be having larger home ranges than they did previously, and also be having increased long distance movements to go in between and through sites. I also believe that there's going to be an increased distance between snakes and nest. So the distance to grassland bird nest and sea constrictors will increase. So how are we going to be doing this? This is one of the new methods that's going to be implemented starting this year. We will be any eastern racer sea constrictor that we capture that is 360 grams, which is less than 2% of the transmitter is less than 2% of the body weight, will be collected. So this is from the objectives of cover boards and drift fences that we capture the snakes under or in. And then we will be taking them to an exotic vet where they will be internal transmitter implementation, as pictured on the right. These snakes will then be tracked daily, Monday through Friday, using automated receivers. So rather than humans going and chasing around an eastern racer, which could affect its movement, we will have receivers taken location records over time. And then the statistical testing will be burned versus unburned sites and looking at nest density and distance from the nearest site of the east where the eastern racer is present. And finally, the objective 4, will there be a change in predation pressure or nest success? And here we have 3 field sparrows that are getting closer and getting a little bit older, and this was actually a nest that was successful. So change in predation pressure on nests increase nest success. So here is the diagram from the previous predictions we've had. I think that prescribed burns are actually going to decrease snake predation on nests, and I think that's going to have an influence on helping nest success, as well as the forbs would also benefit nest success for grassland birds. However, I do think that there's going to be a time lag again, back to this 3 years, that will cause predation events happen more occasionally and happen more often. So to do this kind of project, as you were seeing the previous videos of the snakes predating the grassland bird nest, we will be doing nest monitoring. So once we find the nest through rope dragging or incidental in our sites, we will be checking these nests every 4 to 5 days. And some of these nests will be checked with a camera, so we will be attaching cameras to record the nest over time. And then really looking at this camera footage to look at if there's any predation events occurring. We will also be doing for the nest We will also be aging based on data sheets. So if we see, for instance, the bottom right is a common yellow throat and a brown-headed cowbird parasitism in the nest, we will be aging the chicks by identification, but we will also be doing egg development by float cup technique, which eggs will be, two of the eggs, one egg will be spotted, one egg will be lined, and then we will use float cupping to see the development process based on how high it is going in the float cup or what direction it is. And then we will also be doing statistical burn versus unburned to look at net success based on if the nest was successful that we found through either cameras or through other means, if it was abandoned or not. So I just wanted to give some acknowledgements real quick. This was a huge effort. There's a lot of other methods that go into this from the work that Dr. Glass did, and work that I'm also going to be doing. We had an amazing team last year, as pictured here from the field crew. Dr. Michael Eichholz has been helping with this project and is really a great advisor for me. SIUC Cooperative Wildlife Research Lab, and Champaign County Audubon Society, of course. Thank you for the help in the research. And then we also have Illinois Department of Natural Resources, which is where our huge bulk of funding is coming for this project. So if any questions?
Okay. Did you have a question, Laura?
Actually, yeah. That's super interesting. I never thought of snake predation as being one of the main reasons that grassland birds would be declining. Is that like the number one main reason? Or I'm sure there are other things like if they preferentially select grassland habitat and if that changes, if it's not burned, is snake predation like the number one thing? And if not, what are some of the other things that are causing grassland bird declines?
Yeah, great question. So definitely not the biggest one. Habitat is definitely the biggest one where habitat is really getting decreased. And just the ability to not have the same type of not just the amount of decrease of habitat, but also how habitat is being less favorable. So woody vegetation kind of coming in, and those kind of impacts have been linked to decrease in grassland birds. Snakes are kind of like a compounding variable to that. There's been studies looking at the woody vegetation causing a positive relationship with grassland snakes. So when you have woody vegetation and you have more snakes, then you're causing compounding negative variables to grassland nest success. So not one of the biggest ones, but we're kind of looking at how it's mediated through the success of these nests. But when looking at previous data on just the nest itself, if it was successful or not, about 50% of the ones from 2023 were depredated, and about 20% that we found were abandoned for whatever reason. But another big nest predator is also raccoons or other mesopredators that occur, of course. So that's a kind of a different chapter part. But yeah, so kind of all sorts, predation, habitat, not being the best. So yeah, hope I answered your question.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with raccoons at the Merwin Nature Site. Thanks.
Yeah, yeah. It's kind of brutal seeing the nest videos for the raccoons because I mean the snakes, they do it slow, but the raccoons they just throw their head in there. Yeah.
Okay, well, if there are no other questions, thank you both so much for joining us tonight, and thank you to those who showed up to watch our speakers. And this video will be posted on our YouTube as soon as possible, if you guys want to look out for that. And there are also more events coming up, so make sure to check out our website for that. But yeah, I hope all of you have a great night. Thank you so much again.
Thank you. Have a great night, everyone.